Right. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today for this virtual lecture. This lecture is being hosted by the Museum of the Cape Fear Historical Complex and coordinates with the Fayetteville Area Convention and Visitors Bureau as part of the annual Heroes Homecoming celebration. The mission of the Museum of the Cape Fear Historical Complex is to collect, preserve, and interpret the cultural history of Southern North Carolina and the state for the education and enjoyment of present and future generations. Fayetteville and the communities of Cumberland County created Heroes Homecoming as a way of showing recognition and appreciation to all veterans for their courage, their sacrifice, and everything they do to defend this country's freedom now and forever. This year's theme, Serve, Heal, and Protect, celebrates the heroics and sacrifices of first responders and medical professionals in the military. Medical treatment in the military is essential and highly valued. Colby Lipscomb, Education Coordinator at Bentonville Battlefield State Historic Site, is going to be sharing with you all today some very relevant information about the importance of medical military during the American Civil War. Colby's specialties at Bentonville include Civil War medicine, civilian life, and the natural world. Previously, he worked as a park ranger at Cape Hatteras National Seashore and the Research and Archives Assistant at the Kerala Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies at NC State University. He holds a Master of Arts in Public History from NC State and a Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science from Western Carolina University. He is from Clayton, North Carolina, and is passionate about telling the stories of the history of culture and science in America through the lens of individual people. He has become quite adept in creating and recording digital content at Bentonville Battlefield. He helped to create a series of videos to commemorate the 156th anniversary of the battle at Bentonville earlier this year. You can follow Bentonville Battlefield State Historic Site on Facebook, and you can view all of their videos on their YouTube page. Colby's lecture today is titled, In a Critical Condition, The Fight to Save Lives at the Battle of Bentonville. Occurring near the end of the war, medical treatment at Bentonville represents the culmination of the 4-year struggle to save as many lives as possible in the aftermath of severe and deadly American Civil War battles. Highlighting witnesses to the battle and their experiences as surgeons and patients, Colby will discuss the intense fight to save lives during the Battle of Bentonville. Colby, thank you so much for joining us today. I've very much been looking forward to hearing this lecture. So I'll just let the floor be yours.
All right, great. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Thanks, Leslie, for that great introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, get my PowerPoint up and ready to go, and we'll get started. All right. So just like Leslie said, the title of my presentation is In a Critical Condition, The Fight to Save Lives at the Battle of Bentonville. And so we're going to be talking about how these surgeons and assistant surgeons really fought to save as many lives as possible at Bentonville. And like she mentioned as well, the Battle of Bentonville is happening in March of 1865, the very end of the Civil War. So it's a really great representative case to show the culmination of all of the advancements across the 4 years of the American Civil War, starting in 1861. Here at Bentonville Battlefield State Historic Site, we're lucky to have the historic Harper House, which was used as a U.S. Army field hospital during the battle. And so I'm going to be looking specifically at the Harper House and what happened there, and talk about some of these individual people, what they experienced, what they would have felt, what they would have been going through, and how that's representative of the millions of casualties in this American Civil War, and try to kind of broaden that out a little bit too, and talk about medical care and treatment across the Civil War as a whole. So thank you everybody for listening. I really appreciate it. And before I get started, I'd like to go ahead and do another plug for the Bentonville Battlefield. We do some really great stuff. And if you want to find more information at the end of the talk here, I'm going to give my email and our social media accounts so you can look up more information all about Civil War medicine and the Battle of Bentonville and the Carolinas campaign. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So there we go. So my title comes from a quote from this guy right here. This was a witness to the Battle of Bentonville. His name is Lieutenant Marcus Bates. And Lieutenant Bates was 25 years old at the time of the battle. He was a first lieutenant in the 21st Michigan, and he was wounded on the first day of the battle. And so throughout this talk, we're going to kind of keep coming back to Lieutenant Bates and see his experiences. But I always like to start with this, one, because it'll kind of put into context the quote of my title, but also kind of set the scene for what we're dealing with in Civil War medicine. So this first quote up here, 91 of our regiment had fallen, over a full third of our number in a brief. So that's really telling us the intensity of the Battle of Bentonville, the extreme numbers that the surgeons were having to deal with. So Lieutenant Bates is wounded, and he's able to find his way to a fence corner, kind of away from the battlefield. And here we have him describing what that felt like. How long I lay in that fence corner, I do not know, or when I was removed. The next morning, I found myself lying on my back in a tent filled with wounded men, the one next to me on my left dead. I was conscious that I was in a critical condition and thought of my dear ones at home, thankful that I still had a fighting chance for life. If you haven't been able to tell now why I used Lieutenant Bates, it's because he is an extremely poetic writer. And his words are really powerful and very descriptive of what it felt like to be there. And I also like it because it really presents this underlying presence of hope. And that's a really important theme here in Civil War medicine, is that there is hope. There is a fighting chance for life. That's a really powerful statement there. And we're going to get into a little bit more of what happened to him and how that would have came about. So Army medical care at the beginning of the Civil War proved useless to struggling surgeons dealing with mass casualty events. It's really hard to understand just how unprepared the U.S. Army was for the Civil War, especially the medical corps. And these numbers here kind of give us a little bit of insight into that. So this is 1861. The U.S. Army had about 113 physicians, 30 surgeons, and 83 assistant surgeons. 24 of those resigned to join the Confederate Army, which means the Confederate Army only started with about 24 with U.S. Army experience. These are both extremely low numbers. One Army hospital with 40 beds. That's because the U.S. Army hasn't had to fight a war in over a decade. They just are not prepared for the numbers that are coming their way in terms of casualties and in terms of wounded men to treat. So when we go all the way back to 1861, there's not just rough medical care, there's almost nothing there to work with. So it's a really rough situation for these very few surgeons that are here. You know, what can they really do? The Civil War shocked these surgeons and really required a complete new way of thinking about medical care, a whole new advancements in organizations, treatment, and care. So that's going all the way from the very beginning of just organizing, how are we getting to these guys, how are we taking care of them, and how are we making sure that they survive. And so we're going to look at some numbers here first. And most of us have seen this 620,000 killed during the Civil War. Obviously, this is an estimate. This is not an absolute fact. In fact, it was probably more than that. But what this chart does tell us is that over 1.5 million casualties occurred during the Civil War. Again, these are astronomical numbers. These are numbers that we can't even barely fathom today, 156 years later or so. 476,000 wounded in the Civil War. Just incredible numbers for these 113 guys at the beginning of the war. That's just not fathomable. They're not going to be able to handle that. And to look at some more specifics here, this chart is comparing civil deaths by war, starting with the Civil War way up here at the top, 620,000, that number again. And what I really want to point out here is all the modern wars, of course, are even less than the Civil War. But what's interesting is these three wars down here: the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War. These are the three wars that the surgeons and generals and soldiers of the Civil War were familiar with. These are the ones that had come before the Civil War. So if we look at these numbers, all three of these numbers together barely equal the amount of deaths at the Battle of Gettysburg alone. That's how big of a shift we're dealing with here. Most of these guys had experienced or knew people who experienced the Mexican War. Only 13,000 deaths. That's a lot of people. We're not trying to discount that. But when we're looking at that many deaths in one day at a battle in the Civil War compared to several years of the Mexican War, it's just incomparable, really. And it's really is putting into perspective how dramatic this was for these surgeons dealing with these amounts of deaths and wounds. There's a couple more numbers here, and we're going to look at specific battles. And these are some of the most intense battles. And these are casualties of these, obviously over 50,000 at the Battle of Gettysburg, 35,000 in Chickamauga, 30,000 at Wilderness. These numbers are hard to fathom. You think of the Panther Stadium, and that doesn't even come close to the amount of people that were wounded and killed at the Battle of Gettysburg. Any of these major stadiums and stuff, it's unreal to even imagine that. Now, the Battle of Bentonville doesn't have quite as many casualties. I have about 4,000 casualties total, Union and Confederate. But again, when we're thinking about that actual number of people who need help, who are either killed, wounded, or missing, that is an astronomical number for a small amount of surgeons to deal with. So that is where we're going to see this change happen. We're going to talk about what that meant and how that happened. So going back again to 1861, Army medical care was just inefficient. It just was barely in existence, and they were not doing a lot to really be able to care for soldiers. And that really became evident at the first major battle of the Civil War at Manassas in 1861. So this image here is from Frank Leslie's. It's called The Great Panic. And it really is great at showing how chaotic that battle was. And if you haven't read much about that battle, essentially these two armies came together for what they thought was going to be a short fight that would end quickly in the war, and it'd all be over with. We'd all go home. There were even politicians came from Washington, D.C. to watch the battle and ended up being run out, almost killed themselves in the chaos of battle as the Confederates charged further than anybody would have thought they would have. Obviously, these surgeons that we talked about, these very few surgeons, they have no way of dealing with the amounts of deaths here, the amounts of casualties and wounded to take care of. There are thousands and thousands of wounded lying across the battlefield. They need help, and they're not getting it because there's no organization there to take care of them. After the Battle of Manassas here, soldiers lie on the ground for days, if not even weeks, waiting for help. Dead soldiers lying on the ground for weeks, just rotting in the hot sun. It's a disgusting environment. It's horrible. Many, many, many men died from wounds that were survivable and treatable because there was no one there to take care of. Even if they were able to get themselves off of the battlefield, if they had a wound that was light enough to get themselves off, and they were able to find their ways to one of the very few hospitals around, if they were not part of that regiment, that regimental hospital, they would be turned away and told that we can't treat you. So again, this is a testament to just the unpreparedness of these surgeons to deal with these numbers. So we're going to see all this stuff change in just about a year or so. And we'll talk about that right now. And that is all that change is coming from Dr. Jonathan Letterman. So Letterman, I'll be talking about him a lot. He was not at the Battle of Bentonville, but he is just an absolutely important figure in Civil War history and medical history as well. He was the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. He was promoted to that role in 1862 because of some of these insane unpreparedness from Manassas in these early battles in 1861, 1862. He had been promoted, and he had all these research. So most of this stuff is not stuff that he himself has invented. It's stuff that he is implementing in a really smart way. So he's found these things from French armies, from British armies, from all kinds of places in Europe, even from former U.S. Army organization. And he's compiling all this stuff together into what we call the Letterman Plan. And the Letterman Plan is consisted of these three major points right here. And that's what we're going to talk about. The first of which is a dedicated ambulance corps with dedicated stretcher bearers. So in the beginning parts of the war, there were no real stretcher bearers. Essentially, if you were wounded, you had to rely on your friends, someone in your regiment to get you up and get you to the hospital, or you had to just get there yourself. There was nobody there whose job was to find wounded men and get them off of the battlefield. get them to safety. So that was that first aspect of the Letterman plan. The second is a new hospital organization, and this is setting up division field hospitals. So instead of small regimental field hospitals, he opens that up to division hospitals. So that's several regimental surgeons, division surgeons all together in one place, taking care of literally anyone that showed up. So they had this designation no longer that you had to be part of that division, part of that regiment. Anybody could be treated there, Union or Confederate. That was the policy. That's the way that they did it. Didn't matter who you were, you would get help there. And then finally, the third aspect of this Letterman plan is the categorization of wounded by severity of condition. And if that sounds familiar, that's because that's what we today call triage. Triage was not a term they used in the Civil War, but essentially that's what they're doing. And that's where it comes from, this idea of categorizing wounded by severity of condition. At the beginning of the war, they would categorize the wounded by rank. So officers always got treated first, and then they would go down the line from there. That didn't make a whole lot of sense when you have several hundred privates with really severe wounds and maybe a couple of officers with minor wounds. And you have these privates dying because they weren't treated first. And so Letterman kind of throws all this rank stuff out the window, and he says, we're going to treat the people that need the help most first. And this sounds basic now, but that was revolutionary. And all these things are why they call Dr. Jonathan Letterman the father of modern battlefield medicine, because he instituted these plans across the U.S. Army. Well, he instituted them across the Army of the Potomac, and then they later became policy across the U.S. Army. So Letterman's plan was first put to the test at the Battle of Antietam in 1862, and it was just an absolutely incredible success. So here on the left, we do have a picture of Major Jonathan Letterman. On the right, we have a sketch of medical evacuation after Antietam. If you remember, after the Battle of Manassas, it took them weeks to find all of the dead and wounded soldiers and try to get them some help. At the Battle of Antietam, over 17,000 U.S. soldiers were moved within 24 hours. So they are moving efficiently and quickly. They are getting these soldiers off the battlefield to safety, getting them treated. They are working so incredibly efficiently, and it turned heads across the country. I mean, it was really unfathomable to understand just how dramatic of a difference this was. And Letterman just absolutely incredible what he was able to do there. I did want to go back. I actually forgot to talk about this image here. And I like this image because this really encapsulates what the Letterman plan was. So here we have an ambulance drill. So they're drilling. This is not during battle. They are preparing for battle. This was also not a thing before at the beginning parts of the war. They weren't prepared. They didn't know what they were going to do. It was just kind of a chaos in the moment situation. So here we have stretcher bearers. These guys are probably musicians who also served as stretcher bearers. So they would do their part in the battle to play music. And then once people started falling, they would get rid of their instruments and pick up stretchers and start getting wounded off the battlefield. And then they would take them to a forward aid station or somewhere where they could be triaged, decide if they need further treatment. If they need further treatment, they would put them on an ambulance. And these were four-wheeled ambulances. This is another revolution. In the beginning of the war, ambulances, if they had them, were under the quartermaster department and were two-wheeled ambulances. So because they were operated by the quartermaster department, they were usually filled with supplies. And so when a battle broke out, they were not exactly ready to start carrying wounded soldiers. So Letterman said, no, we're going to have designated ambulance wagons. They're going to be ready to go whenever we need them. And they're going to be four-wheeled. And that means that they're going to get around a lot easier, and it's not going to be as much torture on the soldiers themselves getting to and from the battlefield back to the field hospital. So like I said, this image is a really great encapsulation of what the Letterman plan consisted of. And we'll get into more detail as we go further in and talk about what happened here at Bentonville. So by 1864, the Letterman plan had become official U.S. policy. Congress had passed a law saying that this was the way the medical corps would be organized across the U.S. Army. So this is not just the Army of the Potomac anymore. This is everywhere. This is Western Theater and Eastern Theater. And around the same time, the Confederacy had adopted similar policies. So the Confederacy had noticed how well it worked, and were doing pretty much the same thing. Now, as I keep going, We're going to focus more on the U.S. Army because that's just who happened to be at the Harper House. But I'll try to talk about the Confederacy as well. But by the time we get to 1865, both of them are pretty much doing the same thing. They are operating under the same system. There's a couple of slight differences, especially in like insignia and stuff, but they're pretty similar. Here on the left, we do have a picture of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Here we have those four-wheeled ambulances. You see they're empty. They're ready to go whenever they need them. That's the Letterman Plan in action. On the right, we have Confederate stretcher bearers. These are guys whose job is to get wounded off the battlefield, retreat them to safety, get them to treatment. That's the Letterman Plan in action. So here we have some more of these numbers to compare exactly how far we came from 1861 to 1865. Again, those 113 physicians, 24 resigned to join the Confederate Army in 1861. By the time we get to the end of the war in 1865, the U.S. Army has over 12,000 surgeons, 200 Army hospitals with over 100,000 beds. Confederate Army has 8,000 surgeons and just one hospital with over 5,000 beds. That's a massive hospital. They have really rose to the occasion of trying to deal with and treat these wounded soldiers. And we can really see that with these numbers. Obviously, these 20,000 surgeons in both armies, they're not all going to be medical doctors, medical professionals. They're coming from all walks of life. Many of them are just promoted up through the ranks. Some of them are doctors in their previous life. Some of them were already Army surgeons and are moving their way up. So you get a wide breadth of experience, but because of the medical corps having such a hierarchy and such organization, these guys are able to get trained and get the equipment they need to operate pretty quickly. And so most of them are fairly competent in what they're doing. I know that's a large overstatement for 20,000 men, because obviously you're not going to regulate that much, but the U.S. Army is pretty good at doing that. So they're providing them with what they need for the most part. So to talk a little bit more specifically about what the Letterman Plan meant, first we're going to talk about the hospital organization aspect. So here we have three different flags that meant three different things in part of this hospital organization. So if you were wounded, say at the Battle of Bentonville, and we're going to talk about this a little bit with specific soldiers. If you were wounded, the first place you would find yourself would be stretcher bearers would take you to what was called a forward aid station. That forward aid station could bandage the wound, stop the bleeding, do basic treatment, and then triage and decide whether or not you needed more treatment, send you to a field hospital, or if it was something really minor, they could send you back to your regiment, send you back to camp, say sleep it off, whatever like that. And then that's what this flag down here is going to represent. This is the ambulance guide on. So this is the flag that ambulances would have been carrying to kind of mark them as non-combatant, saying we're off limits essentially. So that is how they're going to be protecting their soldiers, getting them from the battlefield to a field hospital. And that's this flag here. It's a larger flag, but not as big as the general hospital flag. That's going to represent a field hospital. So that green H on a yellow flag signifies field hospital. Again, these are non-combatants. So technically they're off limits. Doesn't always work that way in practice, but technically they're off limits of the battle. And it's a great large marker that says, hey, come here, we will help you. Doesn't matter who you are, you can get treatment here if you were wounded. So field hospitals were usually about a mile or so behind lines. And so they were just outside of artillery ranges. So they were in relative safety, not complete safety, but relative safety. So after the battle was over, you had been treated, got some type of surgery at the field hospital. Then you would be carried to a general hospital. And this is a real hospital in a city somewhere where they could provide more treatment. And that's where we have this large H flag. They're the same flag, they're just one's a little bit larger than that. So that is this hospital organization, and we'll see this play out with the Harper House. So the forward aid stations were usually staffed by assistant surgeons, but this is another part of that Letterman Plan where he's throwing rank out the window. If you're a surgeon and you've been in the Army for however many years, it doesn't matter. He wants his most competent surgeons doing the hardest work. He wants his guys with the most experience in the field. So these are the guys that are going to be doing the forward aid stations. These are going to be bandaging wounds, stopping bleeding, applying tourniquets. Maybe in some scenarios, if they have time, they're going to set bones, stuff like that. Whatever they can do to try to save someone's life, keep them sustainable until they get to the field hospital. This is literally on the battlefield, hiding behind a tree or behind a rock or something like that, just a few hundred yards or so from where the fighting is happening. And very, very close range, very dangerous position they're in. But again, this is just enough to stop bleeding so they can get on an ambulance and take that mile-long ride or so back to a field hospital. Here in the background, you can see some stretcher bearers carrying a wounded soldier up this way. This is Winslow Homer from Harper's Weekly, 1862, showing a surgeon at work. So this is a great depiction of what a forward aid station probably would have looked like. Again, that was that first category in the 3-tier system. And so to look at one of our witness spotlights here, we have Assistant Surgeon John Hostetter, and he was a 44-year-old assistant surgeon. He was with the 34th Illinois, and he would have been operating one of these forward aid stations at the Battle of Bentonville. So we're lucky to have his diary today. I have a couple of quotes here from him. The noise of battle was terrific. I was at Stones River, Lookout Mountain, Mission Ridge, Resaca, Jonesboro, and many other battles with such incessant firing for 3 hours I never heard. Again, the intensity of the Battle of Bentonville is remarkable. Because, I mean, some of these battles have 3-4 times the casualties of Bentonville. Yet in his mind, he's comparing them. So it shows you that intense period of time there at the Battle of Bentonville, where it really felt like one of the worst battles they had ever heard. And then this last quote here, we do have a little bit of a description of what it was like. He's not exactly as poetic as Marcus Bates, but we still get an idea. Was up at 4 o'clock, and as soon as it was light, moved out to the front, dressed wounded all day, and sent the wounded off in ambulances. So he's there early in the morning till late at night, just bring the soldiers in, take care of them, dress their wounds, send them off in ambulances, take care of them, send them off in ambulances. It's just constant flow back and forth, getting these guys the help they need. So that is a really great description of what's happening at these forward aid stations. So now we're going to return back to Lieutenant Bates here. And Lieutenant Bates actually went unconscious when he first was wounded. He was able to find himself to this fence corner. We've already seen this quote before, but I'll read it again because it's in context a little bit more now. How long I lay in that fence corner, I do not know, or when I was removed. The next morning, I found myself lying on my back in a tent filled with wounded men, the one next to me on my left dead. So in that time, he was in the fence corner. Some stretcher bearers found him, brought him to a forward aid station, possibly to John Hostetter or someone like him, just behind a tree or something, trying to treat the wounded, put him on an ambulance, sent him to the field hospital where he would have been treated, had some sort of surgery. We'll talk about his actual wound in a minute. And then he found himself lying on his back the next morning at the field hospital in a tent right behind the Harper House, most likely, with people around him dead and dying. So again, it's a tough situation, but there is this underlying sense of hope where he's talking about this fighting chance for life. So field hospitals at the division level ensured the best surgeons available to save as many lives as possible. Again, this is what we're talking about with Letterman throwing rank out the window. He doesn't really care that much about how long you've been in the Army. He wants the best guys possible at the field hospitals doing these surgeries. And the Harper House is a really great example of a field hospital. These are where the most intense, quick surgeries were happening. So the forward aid station, they're not doing surgeries. They're just getting people sustainable so that they can make it to the field hospital. Field hospital, they're going to do brief surgeries, nothing really involved or intense. They're going to be doing amputations, stuff like that, whatever they need to save the soldier's life immediately in the moment, get them to recovery, and then later, a few days down the road, we'll get them to a general hospital. If they need some more surgery, they can get that there when there's a little bit more time, more resources. So these field hospitals, again, they're makeshift. They're usually in someone's house, smoke houses, kitchens, barns, whatever they can find. They're just kind of in a structure or around a structure. There's tents set up. There's just a whole complex there of a field hospital. This picture here is actually from an event we did a couple years ago, representing the field hospital. So again, you can see the amount of people milling about, tents out front, tents out back. That's kind of the idea of what it would have looked like. It would have been many more people here even than this event at the actual Harper House during the battle. So with these mass casualty events, again, Letterman has developed this system of triage. They didn't use the term then, but I like to use it because it makes the most sense now. And he's sorting wounded by severity of condition. So here we have the three priorities. The first priority, these are the top priority cases. These are the guys that are going to get help immediately. So severe, but if they get treatment, they will survive. They have a really high likelihood of survival, probably about a 60 to 80% survival rate. If they get treatment, probably about a 20 to 40% survival rate if they don't. So this is dramatic. They need help and they're going to get it first. For the most part, these are going to be shattered bones in limbs and extremities. So arms and legs, those type of wounds, they're going to be able to do an amputation, get rid of those shattered bones, reduce the risk of infection, and most likely save the soldier's life. So that's top priority. These are the first cases that are going to get seen. The second priority are less severe and survivable cases. These are guys, if they don't get help immediately, they're still most likely to survive. So these are extremity wounds that are not shattered bones, just broken bones, bullet wounds, scratches, burns, that kind of stuff. People that don't need intense surgery, but they need some type of treatment. So they're going to be seen second. A lot of these guys are just going to be seen at the forward aid station and then sent back to their regiment. So again, if it's something as simple as just a burn or scrape or something like that, they can wrap up that bandage and say, all right, get on back to battle, get on back to your regiment. We're not going to bother with any more resources trying to take care of you because you don't need it, according to them. Some of these guys will make it to the field hospital and maybe see treatment, but not as likely. Then the third priority, this is the final priority. These are severe and likely fatal. So in the Civil War, these are head, chest, and abdomen wounds. There's really not a whole lot the surgeons can do for them. They're going to stop the bleeding. They're going to try to remove the bullet if possible, like if the bullet's still inside of them, because they know that's going to cause infection. But other than that, there's not a lot they can do for them. And just the likelihood of their survival is so low, they're going to see them last. So that's our triage system here. First, second, third priority. And when we get into our witness spotlights here in a second, we'll kind of start looking at what that meant for these individual people and how they were treated. The severity of wounds, especially with the lead mini balls and bullets that were being used during the Civil War, made amputation a necessity to save most of these soldiers' lives. So these lead bullets, whenever they hit, they would completely shatter bones, arms and legs, just shatter bones. And surgeons were smart enough to know that if you just left a shattered bone, you can't just set that. That's not going to heal. That's going to cause all kinds of issues, and it's going to kill the soldier. So they would do amputation as a means of saving that soldier's life. And it was highly efficient. We'll talk about mortality rates a little bit later, but amputations had about a 60 to 80% survival rate. So these guys were living. They were living through amputations. And these surgeons knew what they were doing. They're competent. You got to think most of these surgeons at the Harper House, they have done thousands and thousands of amputations. These guys have been in the Army for 2, 3, 4 years dealing with these mass casualty events. Here on the left, we have our Civil War amputation kit. This is in our exhibit area at Bentonville, and it shows you the amount of tools. You know, this is not some type of just butcher just hacking away at the limbs. They're using different tools, different knives, and they're doing it pretty competently to be able to save that limb and make it as comfortable as possible for the soldier afterward. On the right here, we have a picture of what was a common sight after the war. Soldiers missing arms and legs was very common. It's just an unidentified U.S. soldier, but there he is with his amputated arm. Pretty powerful image. Here we have an engraving of amputation in a field hospital. This is in a tent. This is kind of what those surgeries would have looked like. A couple surgeons operating, what would have been one central surgeon operating, an assistant surgeon assistant, and then probably a steward or two applying medications, applying chloroform, stuff like that. Speaking of chloroform, 95% of all surgeries in the Civil War utilized some form of anesthesia. This is a common misconception. This is a pet peeve of mine. There was no biting the bullet. That is a complete myth. Anesthesia was used in almost every surgery in the Civil War. In the field, it was usually chloroform. And that's because in general hospitals, they were using ether. Ether is a little too volatile to be carrying around in the field with them. So they use chloroform. Almost every surgery at Bentonville, every documented surgery was using chloroform at Bentonville. They had plenty of it. They were using it. This is both sides, Confederate and Union. Union Army is even about 98% of surgeries used chloroform or ether. We do have a picture here on the right of chloroform being administered. They would have just put a little bit of it on a sponge and then wrap that around a cloth and put that over the patient's mouth. So they would breathe in just a little bit of it. Chloroform in a high dosage is lethal, but there's only about 2 or 3 cases of death by chloroform in the Civil War. So these stewards or assistant surgeons, whoever's applying the chloroform, they know what they're doing, and they are able to knock a patient unconscious, but not kill them. So that's a pretty important aspect of what's happening here, is that these soldiers are unconscious for surgery. They're not awake. So again, we're going to talk about the Harper House as representative of a late war U.S. Army field hospital. That's kind of wordy there. Late war, obviously 1865, it's the end of the war. U.S. Army, this is the U.S. Army, not the Confederate Army. And this is a field hospital. So these are about a mile or so behind lines, and they are outside of the artillery range, a place of relative safety. And part of the reason we know place of relative safety is the Harper House has no bullet holes or anything like that. It saw no action during the battle. It was a field hospital, and it served that purpose. So here we have a picture of the house on the left. We can see that yellow flag with the green H on the front porch there, signifying, hey, this is a field hospital. You can come here for treatment. On the right, we have a picture of the house today. This is set up as an amputation room. We have our amputation kit spread out along the table. And you can see this is literally just a door taken off the hinges, put down on top of furniture to create a makeshift operating table. This was pretty common practice. We have record of that happening at Bentonville. So I do have a quote here at the bottom of the screen. This is from Colonel William Hamilton, who was not wounded, but he was able to observe what was happening at the Harper House. And here's his quote. Our badly wounded were gathered into a building nearby, which soon resembled a slaughterhouse. A dozen surgeons and attendants in their shirt sleeves stood at rude benches, cutting off arms and legs, throwing them out of the windows where they lay scattered on the grass. So, dozen or so surgeon and attendants. These are small rooms, probably 3 or 4 operations happening at a time inside the rooms, some happening outside in the front yard under tents. He talks about rude benches. And I think this right here applies pretty well as a rude bench, literally just thrown together, lasting sawhorses and any piece of wood they can find to throw soldiers up on to do their surgeries. This is, again, makeshift field hospital. It's just somebody's house. And of course, the iconic quote, throwing them out of the window where they lay scattered on the grass. This room over here on the right side of the house, this would have been most likely an amputation room. It's the room we're looking at here. And so throwing arms and legs right out, either that window or the window on the other side. There's even one soldier that I don't have pulled up as a witness spotlight, but he talks about being able to find his own arm in the bottom of the pile the day following his surgery. So they're still there. Even the second day afterward, they eventually probably would have buried those limbs. We have not found a limb pit or anything, so we don't know exactly what happened to them. But again, this is real. This happened here at the Harper House. So we're going to talk about some specific cases, some witness spotlights, people who were here. Starting out with Surgeon John Avery. He's kind of the guy running the show. He is the surgeon for the 1st Division of the 14th Corps. He was 41 years old at the time of the battle and from Michigan. He had studied medicine before the war and continued to study it after the war. So he's one of these guys with a little bit of experience. And he is kind of in charge, but he's probably going to be doing surgeries himself because he's one of the more competent surgeons. Letterman would have wanted him in the operating room doing the surgeries himself. So he's one of these guys kind of running the show. Private William Noah is a really interesting case. He was an older guy. He was 34 years old. He was a private. He had enlisted in 1864. And so he'd only been in the Army for less than a year or so by the time of the Battle of Bentonville. He was wounded in the right arm and ended up having his right arm amputated. So you can see this picture on the left is a younger picture of him around the time of the battle. The picture on the right is an older picture of him, and we can't see his right arm, but it's also not there. So obviously we can't see it. We can see his left arm. His right arm's not there. He was one of these positive cases of he survived his surgery. Obviously, it's a classic condition of just a right arm amputation. Ended up saving his life. Lieutenant James Wills. He's a little bit different of a case. He actually had a knee injury and would have been probably considered second priority. So they did not need to amputate. They didn't feel the need to amputate, so they did not amputate him. They were probably removed the bullet or so from the knee, bandaged up the wound and said, all right, you're good to go. Take a few days to recuperate because a knee injury does take a while to recover. And he ended up dying in May. So it took him 2 months to die from complications from the wound. And this was most likely infection that killed him. And we'll hear a lot about the infection that's setting in and killing most of these soldiers. So whereas we saw such a positive experience with William Noah, who had this intense surgery and survived, Lieutenant Wills is just the opposite. He did not even have the surgery and he did not make it. So a lot of tragedy in these Civil War cases. It's just pretty sad to think about what happened to some of these guys. But it's important to tell their stories. Brigadier General Benjamin Fearing, he was the highest ranking officer treated at the Harper House. He was a brigadier general. So he was pretty big guy. He was 28 at the time of the battle, so pretty young for a brigadier general too. And he was from Pennsylvania. He had been promoted several times, started out as a private in April of 1861, and had also been wounded at Chickamauga in 1863. Bentonville was the second wound during the Civil War, and he ended up getting his thumb, index finger, and part of his hand amputated. So he had a hand amputation, parts of his fingers. And now these have very high survival rates. And he lived following the battle. He ended up dying in 1881. And according to records, saying that it was as a result of complications from wounds incurred in the Civil War. Now, I've not been able to find exactly what his wound was at Chickamauga. So we don't know if it was that wound or the wound at Bentonville that ended up killing him, or how that ended up doing that 20 years later. We really don't know. But I still think of him as a successful case because he made it past the Battle of Bentonville. He made it 20 years. So it's kind of a weird case there, but he's interesting because he is such a high-ranking officer. Officers did not get preferential treatment. Again, they were triaged. He would have been first priority because of his amputation. And obviously surgeons knew, hey, this is Brigadier General. We're going to probably treat him a little differently, a little bit better. He did get to recover somewhere else. So he got to recover inside the house. We have an officer's recovery room inside the house. Everybody else is behind the house. And we'll talk about recovery a little bit in a minute too. Lieutenant Amherst Chaney. He's one of my favorite cases, him along with Marcus Bates, because he's a really fascinating guy. He was 24 years old at the time of the battle. So he's pretty young. He was a lieutenant and he was shot through the chest. So the bullet entered him in the back left of his shoulder, went straight through him and exited him in the front right of his chest. So it went all the way through him. So he would have made it to the forward aid station. They would have bandaged him up, stopped the bleeding, made it to the field hospital. They would have seen the bullet went all the way through him. So there's no bullet in him to remove. So most likely they just kind of left him alone. He would have been third priority case, most likely to pass away, to not make it. So it's really not a whole lot they could do for him anyway. They provided some painkillers, try to stop the pain, stop the bleeding. And Lieutenant Chaney survived. He made it through, ended up making it to the General Hospital in New Bern, survived, lived until 1927. And he ended up running he was a state representative of Michigan and ran for governor on the Prohibition ticket. So really interesting guy, had this full life after the battle, after having a likely fatal wound here at the Battle of Bentonville. So he was definitely lucky. One of the reasons I think he survived is probably because he didn't have a bullet inside of him. And so he didn't have surgeons feeling around for that bullet and trying to remove it. So he kind of made it out lucky that way. Also didn't hit any major organs or anything. So that definitely helped him out too. It's a really interesting case. So amputations were not a death sentence. And here we have a great chart of mortality rates from amputations. This is from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And as you can see, pretty much the further away from the heart, the more likely the soldier was to survive. So fingers and toes have over a 90% survival rate with a 3 and 6% mortality rate each. These are guys like Benjamin Fearing. They're most likely to make it. And that's because the infection is just not likely to set in that much. And if it does, the body can recover from it a lot more easily than it can in case of like a hip joint or middle thigh amputation. These are over 50% mortality rates. Hip joint, 83% mortality. That's just awful to imagine, just the very low likelihood of survival there. But there are some cases that survived hip joint amputations, and you see that. You even see some with double hip joint amputations that survived. So again, there's this underlying presence of hope. There are people that are surviving surgeries that would not have survived just a few years before. There's also people dying from injuries that would have survived just a few years after. So you kind of get both sides of this during the Civil War. It's pretty difficult, but that's the reality of it. We see knee joint also has about a 58% mortality rate, so it's a little bit higher. Whereas forearm, 14%, upper arm, 24%. So these arm injuries they're pretty likely to make it. So this again, upper arm is William Noah, 24% mortality rate. So returning to our good friend, Lieutenant Marcus Bates, he had been wounded in the hip. So a bullet had entered him and had stayed inside of his body in a sort of delicate area there around the hip inside of him and was there. And so we know this quote, "The next morning I found myself lying on my back in a tent filled with wounded men, the one next to me on my left dead." So this is him in a hospital recovery tent outside the Harper House. This image on the right is not from Bentonville. It's from a hospital ward outside of Petersburg, but it's around the same time, 1865, gives us a good view into what Marcus Bates might have been experiencing, what he might have seen when he woke up. Because of his wound in his hip, he would have been third priority. So he would have been treated last, and they would have tried to remove the bullet, but not been able to find it. So when they couldn't find it, they just kind of left it there, stopped the bleeding, gave him some painkillers to help with the pain. So here he is talking about his experience that morning after he awoke. Our surgeon, Dr. Goodell, who was the assistant surgeon for the 21st Michigan, so that was his regiment, it's the surgeon that he's been going with the whole time in the war, he knows him pretty well, was looking at me and with a cheery good morning, wanted to know how I felt. I don't know what answer I made him. I was conscious that I was in a critical condition and thought of my dear ones at home, thankful that I still had a fighting chance for life. Again, we hear that quote again that I talked about at the beginning, that underlying sense of hope there. And we'll see a little bit more of that with him. Dr. Avery, who we talked about earlier, he's the surgeon of the 1st Division, in company with the Corps surgeon, Waldo C. Daniels, who was Dr. Avery's boss. So he is the guy in charge of the whole 14th Corps medical situation. So he's the surgeon for the whole 14th Corps, who, after looking at me and inquiring of Dr. Goodell what he was doing for me, remarked, "Nothing more can be done for him." This is that third priority. There's literally nothing more that they can do for him. They're going to do their best, but that's all they can do now. They just hope for the best for him. And here he is. "I knew my chances were slim, and after my friends had gone out of the tent, I heard some of them saying they would have to leave me there. And I remember recording a vow that I would not fill a North Carolina grave then, and I think that resolution saved me." So us as North Carolinians probably take a little bit of offense to that, but you can imagine him coming from Michigan. Filling a North Carolina grave is probably one of the worst things he could do, especially at the end of the Civil War. He did not want to do that. He wanted to make it home to his family, and he did. So it's very lucky for him. He made it through this really, really intense injury. It would have been a death sentence not long before the Civil War. So following surgery and recovery, these guys like Marcus Bates, when he awoke the next morning, they do have painkillers for them, mostly opium and opium products like laudanum, which is a combination of opium and alcohol. This is what they're giving soldiers for recovery after their surgeries, to help with the pain. Obviously, after the war, we get a lot of opium addictions. It's a really interesting conversation there. I can't even get into too much with it there, but to mention it. But yes, we get a lot of opium addictions after the war. They also had morphine, and they're using powdered morphine, and that's usually using before surgery to try to stop the pain before they would do the so like Ford aid stations, stuff like that. They're going to be using morphine sometimes after recovery too. But again, opium, laudanum, stuff like that. They're using alcohol for a lot of stuff. Alcohol was used actually as a stimulant, which is exactly the opposite of how we know it to be now. But they would use it to cure shock. The surgeons would use it to stay awake and stay conscious while they were doing surgery. Whiskey would have been proliferated everywhere around field hospitals. It's pretty hard to imagine, but the one thing they didn't use it for was for disinfecting things, because they didn't know anything about infections. Well, they knew what infections were, but they didn't know what caused them. So they don't know germ theory quite yet. But here on the right, we have the interior of a hospital tent and a dispensary. So dispensaries were operated by hospital stewards, which mostly had experience with apothecaries before the war. So they kind of knew about drugs, and they were also called druggists. They would have been administering the painkillers and stuff like that. And they would have been right outside the Harper House in a setup pretty similar to this one, with the pannier and all their different medications and stuff like that. They would have been a little bit more important in camp life, because they're the ones that are dealing with all the diarrhea, dysentery, all those nasty diseases. And then we're not even talking about in this conversation here, but that's what they were doing. So. Confederate Army in 1865, I didn't want to mention them since we've been talking about the U.S. Army at the Battle of Bentonville this whole time. They're doing pretty much the same thing, except for on the other side of the battlefield. So behind Confederate lines was the village of Bentonville. And here we have an image of the village of Bentonville following the battle. We can see most of it is on fire over here to the right side, just because of the chaos of battle, as things had set up on fire all of these longleaf pine trees that have been exposed through the tar pitch and turpentine trade. They're just on fire, the whole village was. But parts of the village were used by the Confederate Army as a field hospital. Pretty much any of the buildings, there's the carriage shop here in the village was used as a field hospital, as well as John Harper, who owned the Harper House. His son, J.J. Harper, had his own house in the village of Bentonville that was used as a Confederate field hospital. So the Harpers kind of saw both sides of the battle through that field hospital lens. And I wish we had more from JJ about his experiences as a part of a Confederate field hospital. But his house ended up being burnt following the battle, as did most of the village. And so there's not really much of the village left today. But to get a little bit more insight into the Confederate Army, we can talk about this guy here. This is Private Albert Q. Porter, and he was a musician in the Confederate Army. And he wrote about his experiences after the war. He was a stretcher bearer. So he was a musician, and then once the battle started, he would put his fife down and pick up a stretcher and find wounded soldiers and get them to relative safety at the Ford aid station. So we can have a little bit of insight from him. Here, the cannonading was terrific beyond description. The roar of small arms was terrible. So again, these are the same words that we're hearing from everyone on both sides. It was an intense battle, just very loud and horrific experience. Our band was ordered to report to the division hospital to take care of the wounded 1.5 miles from the battlefield. We had a very hard time of it, lifting wounded and assisting the surgeons in amputating. The surgeons were busy all night amputating and did not get through. The poor Southerners who were wounded are now, while I am writing, laying all around me on the ground, suffering and bleeding. Oh, how I do feel for them. We were busy all day in sending off the wounded in wagons and ambulances to Smithfield. So throughout all of this, we can see the Letterman plan in action in the Confederate Army. We see division hospitals instead of regimental hospitals. That's Letterman. We see him as a stretcher bearer and lifting wounded, and he's even assisting surgeons in amputating. Surgeons busy all night amputating. And finally, we see them heading off to Smithfield, where they would have had a little bit more intense of a hospital. They also sent them to, most of them ended up actually in Charlotte at a general hospital there until the war was over, where they could get further treatment. So again, Confederate Army is doing pretty much the same stuff as the U.S. Army at the Battle of Bentonville. Because this is the end of the war, this is the point in time everyone has made these advancements. They have figured out through trial and error what works, and the Letterman plan works. So we're going to revisit this image again. So now we're going to be talking about the General Hospital. So we talked about moving from the forward aid station by ambulance to the field hospital. Next, after the treatment during the battle, this is cannonading, all that stuff's happening. They're treating at the field hospital in relative safety. Once the battle was over, they would transport their wounded to the nearest general hospital. And so these are these massive flags here. These are actual institutions that are created to be hospitals. They have more resources, more staff, all that stuff. So general hospitals, especially in the case of here, is where you see more of the female nurses coming into play too. Especially in the Carolinas campaign, with Sherman's army having cut off supplies, he doesn't have any female nurses traveling with the army. So these are all male nurses, all soldiers, completely within the U.S. Army at the field hospital. General hospitals are where you see a little bit more of that type of care, the civilian care coming into play, at least here in this campaign. Now, when you're talking about Virginia, that's a whole different story. That's a whole different discussion. But here in the Carolinas campaign, that's the case. So I do have this map here that might be a little bit helpful for people as I talk about these different places. This is a pretty confusing Civil War map of North Carolina. All the battles and stuff don't really matter as much for my talk, but it is helpful to look at. The big red star here is Bentonville, the little red star is Goldsboro, and then the medium star is New Bern. So after leaving Bentonville, they would take wagons, these ambulances, to Goldsboro, and then get on the train to New Bern. New Bern is where Foster General Hospital was located. That's where most of these soldiers are going to get more intense treatment. They're going to be there for a while, recovering from their injuries. They're in New Bern. And so if you go to New Bern, they do have a national cemetery there. And that is where a lot of these guys from Bentonville that made it there, they're buried there. Many of the guys that died at Bentonville are buried at the Raleigh National Cemetery. So a little bit of geography there for you. Confederates would have gone to Smithfield and then back to Raleigh up to Greensboro. So they're doing kind of the opposite move there. So here we have a picture of Foster General Hospital in New Bern. Again, this is a massive structure. There's a lot more going on here. That's where most of the U.S. soldiers would have been brought after they had been treated at the Harper House, including Lieutenant Bates. Here's a picture of a hospital train that they would have been carried on from Goldsboro to New Bern. So we get a bit of an idea of what that would have been like. And we're going to revisit Lieutenant Bates here. He ended up making his way to Goldsboro. He was annexed with Lieutenant Lyon, lying flat on the bottom side by side. When we were taken to the train to go to New Bern, I was lifted up and shoved onto an open flat car. Soon another man was shoved on the car alongside me. And turning my head to see who it might be, imagine our mutual joy as my brother greeted me. So his brother had been fighting in the same regiment as him, and Lieutenant Bates had been wounded before him, so had no idea of his fate, ended up visiting him at the Harper House, and was wounded later and ended up on the same train car with him on the way to New Bern. So they were able to reunite. And then they were taken to the hospital at David's Island, New York Harbor, where they remained until peace was declared and they were discharged. So Lieutenant Bates, remember, has this bullet stuck inside of him. They couldn't get it out at the Harper House. So they put him on a wagon ambulance, sent him to Goldsboro, put him on a train, sent him to New Bern. He was there for a while. They needed a little bit more, so they actually ended up sending him on a boat to Camp General Hospital in New York, where they finally were able to remove the bullet. And then he was discharged and sent home eventually, where he lived a long, full life until 1921 and ended up fathering 2 children after the war too. So really incredible case there for Lieutenant Bates, that he was able to make it through and have a full life after the war, even after that really intense injury. So here we have a picture of DeKalb General Hospital at David's Island in New York, right outside of New York Harbor. So again, most deaths in the Civil War were caused by disease and not bullets on the battlefield. Here we have a great chart. This is hard to kind of depict in chart form, but I eventually found this from the American Battlefield Trust. This is the U.S. Army only, and this is by state. But the red here is from disease deaths, and the blue are combat deaths. So today we've been talking solely about combat wounds and combat deaths. Haven't even touched on disease and camp life, which killed way more soldiers than did the combat deaths, combat wounds and stuff like that. So just the amount of death is really unfathomable in the Civil War. And this chart kind of shows a little bit of that. So surgeons made a lot of advancements in medical treatment, but they also suffered from a lack of knowledge about sanitation, infection, and disease. So here we have this kind of balancing act of lots of medical advancements, but yet kind of still very archaic at the same time. So it's very much this transition phase that we see in the Civil War. We have this picture here of a general hospital. Well ventilation was something they discovered was really good. Fresh air is good for wounds. And so they're having these well ventilated hospitals. That's really positive. Moving toward the right direction. The types of surgeries they're doing are moving in the right direction. All these organizational things are moving in the right direction. But at the same time, they don't know anything about germ theory. Surgeons at the Harper House are not cleaning their instruments. They're not disinfecting anything. So infection is still running rampant. So there's a lot of these guys that are surviving wounds they would have died from a couple years after. There are many guys dying from wounds that they would have survived a couple years after the war. So it's not but a couple years later that germ theory starts to become more recognized and renowned in medical circles. So really unfortunate, but at the same time, it's these trial and errors through mass casualties that create these advancements and allow these surgeons to start discovering how the human body heals and how best to save these lives. So I'm going to end with some quotes from Surgeon John Moore, who was the medical director in charge of Sherman's army at the Battle of Bentonville. So he's the big boss at the Battle of Bentonville in terms of medical care. So here he has just in a report to General Sherman about medical care throughout the entire Carolinas campaign. And so we'll see a lot of Jonathan Letterman and how well it worked. I think I've never seen so many men with amputations doing so well in the most elaborately arranged hospital. And this is at Foster General Hospital. Every year's experience tends to prove the advantage of treating wounded men in tents, where they can enjoy the ventilation almost of the open air. On the march, the system of division hospitals was kept up and found to work well. There was no lack of any article essential to the comfort of the wounded. This includes chloroform, as well as opium and morphine and all that, all the medical things they needed, even though they were cut off from supply lines the whole time. And the new system of ambulance organization has been more or less completely carried into effect in all the Corps and has worked well. So Letterman plan, it works. And that's what he's pretty much saying. All right, well, thank you everybody for listening. I really appreciate it. For more information, feel free to visit Bentonville. We give tours of the Harper House and we talk about Civil War medicine. We also give regular talks throughout the day with some more specifics. We do witness spotlights, all kinds of great stuff like that. Also, feel free to check us out on social media at Bentonville SHS. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. And all of those are going to have information about Civil War medicine and all that great stuff. So check us out, give us a follow. Our YouTube, like Leslie mentioned at the beginning, has our Bentonville 156 event, which has talks about Civil War medicine, has virtual tours of the battlefield, and all kinds of stuff all about the Battle of Bentonville and the Carolinas campaign. Also, feel free to email me. My email is right there on the screen. And if you have any questions or want more information about visiting or even volunteering, we're happy to have volunteers anytime, whether it's giving talks, doing maintenance, or whatever. I'm also the volunteer coordinator, so happy to talk to you about that and answer any questions. And then finally, if you want more detailed information, I highly recommend checking out the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I am a museum member. They're located out of Frederick, Maryland. They do some really great work. They have an awesome YouTube channel, and they're just constantly posting new stuff all about Civil War medicine. They have a great location museum there in Frederick. They also have the Pry House Field Hospital and the Clara Barton Museum and House. So they have tons of great stuff. So I highly recommend checking them out. And if Leslie, you have any questions for me or anything, we can start to wrap it up.
Colby, thank you so much for just a well put together presentation. I was really looking forward to this, and you delivered. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I really appreciated the perspective you gave at the beginning. You know, and it's important to note that while at the end of the Civil War, that the medical treatment wasn't perfect, but what great improvements were made over those 4 years. You know, to go from 113, you know, surgeons to 20,000 total, or to go from one hospital to 200 is really extraordinary growth. I do have a question about, you have such a great repository of these personal spotlights. Where do you have this information housed? What do you pull from to get this, this research?
Yeah, so most of the witness spotlights that I did today come from a program that I do called Treating the Wounded. And that program has developed, it's an adult program and a field trip program. So there's two different kind of talks that I give. It was first developed as a field trip program where kids can kind of put themselves in the shoes of a surgeon and try to figure out how to treat these soldiers. They can put them into categories and stuff. So most of this research I've developed from Civil War data, Ancestry.com, Fold3, just kind of anywhere I can find it on the internet. Same thing with pictures and stuff like that. So we are developing a better database for casualties at Bentonville. We have a working one now, but we're working on getting something a little bit more involved. So we don't have all the casualties at Bentonville, but we have a good amount of them. And we've been trying to do more research on Harper House as well as others treated elsewhere on the battlefield. So I also mentioned that 2019 event we did, we had 71 actual people that were treated there, what happened to them, and they were portrayed by reenactors at the event themselves. So when you were walking through, you saw real people playing real people, essentially. So that's just kind of an ongoing project we're doing more research on.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think a historian's job is never quite done, right? There's always more to dig into and more to discover.
That's the fun of it.
Yeah. But thank you so much. You know, I think in this Heroes Homecoming theme of serve, heal, and protect, I do love that you kept pulling back to Bates and this quote of, his fighting chance for life. And, I just want to end it by highlighting that, the medical professionals in the military today, I think still kind of offer this hope and a fighting
Absolutely.
chance that was, really started in this Letterman way of thinking and, the way that this was rolled out in the American Civil War. So it's great to see how something, 156 years ago can still be so relevant for us in conversation today. So just want to say thank you, and I appreciate that so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for letting me talk.
Yeah,
I enjoyed
absolutely.
it.
And now, I'm looking forward to my next visit to Bentonville. I've been there a couple of times before, but I certainly will be returning.
All right, great.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.